going to wind up seeing a 2-0 in the feature match area, which will be Charles playing the 5-color Landfall deck, or 5-color Lands deck, going up against Matt Zhu, who we saw earlier on camera fall to Ygra, but battled his way back in round number 2 and is now back on camera in the same seat, if you haven't noticed, on the Jund Sacrifice deck. So this is going to be a metagame showdown, I believe, here, as Matt Zhu on the right has already started off pretty powerful with a Scavenger's Talent and a Witch's Oven, whereas Charles has a Mana Confluence and a Portable Hole that wound up eating away a Cauldron Familiar that was played on turn 1. This is a very quick and fast game, though, as both players have already taken a little bit of damage, Charles from his lands and Matt from his own as well. From a couple of shocks here, as Nissa, Nissa Reborn Animist, Resurgent Animist, comes down onto the battlefield here for Charles. This is going to be a very key feature to the Landfall deck, which is going to want to get and claim the Firstborn here. So even though we wound up having this card come down on 3, there was no Landfall effect to start finding additional cards, such as elves or elementals, like the Omnath in the list. However, it is going to wind up being just a quick attack and a sacrifice with the Witch's Oven, so a swing of 5 damage, a treasure being made, a quick little tick up here from the Scavenger's Talent, and it's Matt Zhu who's putting the pressure on in this matchup. Normally the Sacrifice decks struggle a little bit against the 5-color decks. However, with Charles's deck, he doesn't have a lot of the same sort of main deck board wipes and main deck removal, and instead relying a lot of life gain, a lot of landfall triggers, like this Lotus Cobra coming into play, followed up by a Fabled Passage. This is kind of the dream here for Charles's deck. Lotus Cobra, of course, a all-star from formats of past, was wound up being reprinted in a more recent Zendikar format, and has the landfall effect that whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you get to generate 1 mana of any color. So what we saw Charles doing here is following that up with a Fabled Passage, which is the only fetch land technically available in Pioneer. We do have the Streets of New Capenna lands as well, which are the tapped enters the battlefield tap fetches, which we are going to wind up seeing Charles's deck also running. This means with Lotus Cobra coming in, looks like before this land actually hits the battlefield, Matt Zhu is going to wind up fatal pushing that one away, so Charles will not have 2 floating mana, just the 1. It doesn't have anything to follow it up for only 3 mana, unfortunately. Actually, it looks like he may have had, he bought a Yorion off of that. That's what he wound up doing here. Just shortcutting for the players, as it looks like Matt wound up going through to his turn. We had Charles taking a damage off of his Mana Confluence in order to buy that Yorion there. Matt now, second Scavenger's Talent hits the battlefield. So that's going to be a lot of food we can make as soon as we start chugging through things with our Witch's Oven. Another quick attack here from the Goblin Shaman winds up knocking Charles down to 9. The flipped Reflection of Kiki-Jiki will be online next turn. Matt's got a decent amount of mana available. Don't know what he quite has in hand, however, as we don't necessarily see anything at all. This could just be Matt Zhu being hellbent at this point in time. Potentially just looking to level up the Scavenger's Talents. Doesn't have any creatures in the graveyard either, so doesn't really have a target for the chapter 3 of Scavenger's Talent, and now may just be debating if he wants to actually get rid of just a food or treasure token. No, it looks like instead contemplating if he wants to sacrifice the Goblin Shaman token, if he wants to level up the Scavenger's Talent beforehand. No, instead, Matt's going to be taking the opportunity to level up Scavenger's Talent to 3, so that is now going to be able to, at the beginning of each end step, or his end step, Matt is going to be able to sack 3 other non-land permanents, and if they do, return a creature card from their graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. None of those creatures currently exist in Matt Zhu's graveyard. However, if one does wind up getting in there, he can bring it back, such as a Ygra. And if he winds up milling things over by sacrificing things at Witch's Oven, that'll start a chain that we saw him doing in round number 1. All right, we are going to have an Annie joins up as Charles gets the turn passed back over to him. This is going to wind up entering the battlefield, deal 5 damage to a creature or planeswalker, which is going to target the Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, which will then let Matt Zhu sacrifice it with the Witch's Oven. making some additional food tokens off of the Scavenger's talent. But now if a triggered ability of a legendary creature Charles controls would trigger, it happens a second time. So this is like an anti-harmonicon for all of the legendary creatures in Charles's deck. That includes Omnath, it includes Nissa, there's some Bezas and some Lumras running around there. So that's going to be double triggers for all. Speaking of double triggers, Matt Zhu's going to level up this other Scavenger's talent to 3. Does wind up finding a Cauldron Familiar for the turn. And now we're going to wind up having some Cauldron Familiar shenanigans here. I believe Charles should be down to 8 off of these Cauldron Familiar triggers, but we'll just wait for the opponent, for the players to update the life pad themselves before I wind up doing some bad math. Oh, and there's a Ygra that winds up getting milled over as well. So with those level 3 Scavenger's talents, Matt Zhu at the end of his turn can sack 3 of those foods, bring the Ygra back, bring the cats back, and that's going to be enough to knock Charles out of the game number 1. All right, the Jund Sacrifice deck is able to grab a game from the 5 Color Lands deck here. Didn't necessarily need the Ygra combo, but if Charles was able to untap and start getting something on the line, like potentially a Beza, that is going to be a lot of life, a lot of cards, and a lot of tokens that he was going to be able to make because of that doubling from anti-joins up. So if that was the case, then Matt may have been in a little bit of trouble, and finding that Ygra in time is going to be a way that Matt can definitely lock up his game plan there. Now, in a lot of these 5-color matchups, the Jund Sacrifice deck, or the old Rakdos Sacrifice deck, is usually going to be on the back foot against the 5-color deck, normally in game number 1s, but most importantly post-sideboard. Now, the big reasoning that this game number 1 went so in favor of Matt Zhu was that Charles's deck is not going to be the typical Niv to Light or Enigmatic Fires deck, which means that it's not necessarily going to be running things like Temporary Lockdown main deck, and it's definitely not going to have access to Deafening Clarion, which basically says 3 mana, deal 3 damage to everything, which will kill basically everything except for Ygra out of the actual sack deck side. So Charles's deck is running Ill-Timed Explosion. I know that is a 4 mana sweeper that can deal as much damage as whatever card you discard in order to get a bunch of damage over the top of bigger threats, and can basically kill anything that is going to wind up being in the Rakdos Sacrifice deck. However, it doesn't necessarily have the same kind of oomph or the same speed to it that the 3 mana board wipes are going to have. Most importantly, these are destroys effects and not things like Temporary Lockdown that are exile effects. Now, Charles's deck does have access to Portable Hole, which we saw stopping a cat on turn 1 in the previous game, but if he doesn't have things like Temporary Lockdown in his sideboard, this could be a rougher matchup for the 5-color deck than you're anticipating. Normally, in matches where your life total is being pressured, the life gain from the new Capenna fetches, whenever they wind up entering the battlefield, you gain life, you sacrifice them, you find a basic, the basic enters the battlefield tapped. Normally, that is going to buff your life total enough, especially when you wind up cycling it through with things like Splunking, when you Lum Run, put things back, when you Worldsoul's Rage and put them back into play. You can very easily gain upwards of, going up to like 30 life in this deck. I saw Charles on the floor in round number 2 as we were waiting for things to kind of end. He wound up going up to 36 life in a specific matchup. So we know that this deck can gain a ton of life, and we know that this deck has ways to survive. However, when you are the Rakdos Sacrifice deck and you wind up having a way to deal an infinite amount of life damage, you're not necessarily going to be under the same amount of pressure that the 5-color lands deck is normally going to be able to apply to other decks that need to deal combat damage to get through. So we'll see if Charles has any other sort of exile removal, if he has things to kind of deal with Matt's graveyard, or if there's just going to be, hopefully on the play, a bit of a faster clock here from Charles with things like Ancient Cornucopia, or I don't know if he's running, I don't think you're running Sylvan Caryatid in this version of the deck. So if Charles has his mana acceleration, he's going to be able to get ahead of the Sacrifice deck, and then it's really on Matt to draw into the Ygra combo or bust. Meanwhile, Charles can potentially just go up his curve, do his thing, and try to Worldsoul's Rage Matt out of the game as quickly as possible. It looks like things are going to be a little fortuitous for Charles, as he is keeping his first 7 cards, and Matt Zhu is going to be taking a mulligan down to 6. Now, I think I may have seen a Beza in Charles's hand, but I didn't necessarily get a good look at the rest of what his 7 was that he kept. Matt taking a look at his first mulligan hand. Looks like Scavenger's Talent, Pair of Lands, double Scavenger's Talent, actually. And a very big thing with this Jund Sacrifice deck is the access to green mana means that Matt Zhu actually wound up bringing, looks like, Abrupt Decay in from his sideboard. So if he's anticipating Charles playing any of those exile removal effects like the Portable Hole we saw in game number 1, that is not going to be a big factor if Abrupt Decay can just kill that and get the cat back, kill that, get the talent back. Charles does have one of those Streets of New Capenna lands and is going to immediately go up to 21 and then pass the turn. However, Matt is going to wind up playing a Shock and a Cat, so after all that dust settles, it is just going to be 20-19 after all. But Charles has another one of those fetch lands coming into play. That is potentially going to be finding a mana that he needs to cast Lotus Cobra, but Lotus Cobra is not going to come out till turn 3 because this is unfortunately an enters the battlefield tapped land. So it looks like double Cabaretti Courtyard was what Charles wound up playing. And he's actually just going to stay at 20 because there's a swing coming in from the cat here from Matt Zhu as well. Matt's going to say this cat is expendable, though. Does wind up casting Deadly Dispute. So we're going to wind up drawing 2 cards, creating a treasure token, and sacrificing the cat in the meantime. But with that Scavenger's Talent in hand, Deadly Dispute is not as bad as it used to be when you were like sacrificing cats to try to get value. Scavenger's Talent can make an excess amount of foods, and then you're going to wind up being able to bring the cat back pretty quickly. All right, now Charles's deck is doing its thing. It's got a Lotus Cobra on the battlefield, and we're going to wind up having another one of these Capenna fetch lands coming into play. So even though that land will enter the battlefield tapped, we're still going to wind up having at least 1 floating mana as yet another Fatal Push comes in here from Matt Zhu. Has to sacrifice the treasure in order to do so, but what that does is it stops Charles from being able to play a 2 mana follow-up spell here, as there's only 3 mana follow-up spells. There's only 1 floating mana in his mana pool from that land entering the battlefield, and this is going to allow Matt to untap, play land number 3 for the turn, and play Fable of the Mirror Breaker. It's everybody's favorite Pioneer card. Ooh, that's a pretty solid 3 mana play there from Charles as well. This Splunking, if it came into play last turn, would have been a pretty powerful thing to do, as it allows you to put an additional land into play too. So Splunking Me is basically a mini amulet type effect. Of course, doesn't stack the same way amulets do, so multiple Splunkings won't give you multiple untaps. But basically, when it enters the battlefield, you get to draw cards. It's a cantrip. You put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield, and if you put a cave in the battlefield this way, you gain 4 life. But this allows lands to enter the battlefield untapped. So all of these Capenna fetch lands are now just straight up normal fetch lands. So we wind up seeing a swamp enter the battlefield from that, and then we see a Port of Carfell coming out from Charles's deck as well. This is going to be a land that can be sacrificed in order to mill 4 cards and return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this will be a way to get Omnath, Nissa, or any of those Lumras or Beza type cards back from your graveyard if you mill them over, or if they wind up dying the first time around. So this is just another powerful, originally in Kaldheim card from that cycle of those activated ability lands that generated a color of mana, but then were sacrificed for double. And speaking of double, we are seeing 2 Fable of the Mirror Breakers here coming out from Matt Zhu. Wind up pitching away, it looks like a land and a Scavenger's Talent to draw 2 additional cards. So there's that Abrupt Decay could just wind up being pointed at the Splunking here to turn off Charles's extra mana generator. And that is what's going to wind up happening here. So Matt's going to wind up Using the treasure token, tapping the other overgrown tomb there. Charles did wind up gaining an extra life from one of those fetch lands, but then took 2 damage from that Goblin Shaman swinging in. And with these fetch lands just keep on coming, this Splunkin and this Lotus Cobra being off the battlefield are good things here for Matt Zhu, as Charles is just going to have to play lands the old-fashioned way. However, we do have 5 in play, which means that Beza is online but will not gain life. It means that we could have Nissa followed up by another 2 mana play. We can wind up having Lotus Cobra, but most importantly now we have a plethora of planes on the battlefield, which could be representing any sort of temporary lockdown shenanigans from Charles's side if he has those in from the sideboard. Charles is a connoisseur of the triple sleeve deck, so all these shuffles may take a couple of moments, but ooh, this ill-timed explosion is looking like a good-timed explosion. So this is the board wipe of choice that I talked about coming out from Charles's main deck. You have to draw 2 cards, then you can discard 2 cards. And when you do, Ill-Timed Explosion will deal X damage to each creature, where X is the greatest mana value among cards discarded this way. A Kenrith is going to wind up hitting the graveyard, and with that Port of Carfell, one is in Charles's graveyard, and one should be in play underneath that Plains and Swamp on the bottom of your screen. You can wind up bringing that Kenrith back next turn if you want to. It will enter the battlefield tapped, but you'll still have it, and then you'll have a mana sink for all this mana that Charles is going to be putting into play. Though it does look like that Charles doesn't have a second black source yet, so Port of Carfell might not be able to be sacrificed after all. All right, second Fable. Pitches a Haywire Might and a land. We have a Witch's Oven and a Blood Tithe Harvester getting played from Matt Zhu's side. Another fetch land puts Charles up 1 more life. Goes up to 22. I think this is another... Okay, so this is going to be a fetch land that I think it's Brokers. I don't know, whatever the Esper colored one is. Gonna be finding an additional swamp, and ooh, we got Lumra hitting the battlefield. This is a big haymaker from Charles's deck. Not only are we getting back all of these fetch lands, but we're also going to be getting a big bad star. Power and toughness equal to the number of lands you control, plus you get the mill 4 cards ETB, and then you get to return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tap. So how many lands is this? This is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fetch lands. And we wind up seeing an Omnath enter the graveyard. We wind up seeing a Mystic Sanctuary coming out from Charles as well. So Mystic Sanctuary with 3 islands in play, which Charles should have, is going to wind up putting one of these instants or sorceries from his graveyard back on top of his library. So this Mystic Sanctuary doesn't have any loops like you might have seen from some of the Scape Shift combo decks with, what is it, Wild Reclamation, whatever, the Reclamation, not Wilderness Reclamation, that's the enchantment. Splendid Reclamation, that's the card I'm thinking of. But this is going to wind up entering the battlefield untapped, and you can, of course, put an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. So now Charles can put an Ill-Timed Explosion on top of his library if he so chooses to. He could wind up putting, I don't know what other instants or sorceries he had in his graveyard at the time. Does he have the 3 islands he needs, actually? It looks like he might only have 2. All right, so Charles is counting up. He has 15 mana. Nice and pretty. Divides it up by the different basic land types. And only the 1 island, though. So Charles is not going to wind up getting the Mystic Sanctuary trigger. But he does have a 15/15 Lumra with Vigilance and Reach. So Matt now has to try to figure a way out to not only get through the 15/15 that Charles has on the battlefield that cannot be hit by a Fatal Push because it's a 6-cost creature, but also needs to find a way to deal 28 damage to Charles. Double Reflection of Kiki-Jiki is definitely a way to start doing this, however. So we have Double Reflection of Kiki-Jiki. So what we can do from Matt Zhu's side is, with this Reflection of Kiki-Jiki and a second Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, we can have one target the other at the end of Charles's turn. This basically allows an extra copy to enter the battlefield. It has haste, so then you can go back and target another Reflection of Kiki-Jiki. So you wind up having as many Reflections of Kiki-Jiki as you have access to mana, which is currently 4. But if you play a Thoughtseize here, that's only 1. Oh, sorry, only 3. But then you would be able to make at least as much mana as you have copies of Blood Tithe Harvester, which will make that many blood tokens. So at this point, Matt could potentially make 4 Harvesters, 4 tokens. That means -8, -8. 2 of those Blood Tithe Harvesters at haste can get sacrificed to get rid of the Lumra. There will be 2 additional ones, so that's 9 plus the Reflection of Kiki-Jikis, which would be 2 of them available, I believe. And that would wind up being just enough to deal 9 damage to Charles, which is a start, but then you've used up all of your mana. And you're not able to really keep up these Blood Tithe Harvest or these Reflections to do that again. So it looks like Matt just plays a Thoughtseize, or bins the Thoughtseize off the Blood token, it looks like. Passes the turn. So now Charles, yet another fetch land, now goes up to 29. So we're very quickly approaching the area where Matt may just be digging for a Ygra or bust. But as I mentioned, we still have the availability to make 4 Reflections. We can make 5 copies of Blood Tithe Harvester now. That would be 5 blood tokens, which gives -10, -10. So again, 2 Blood Tithe Harvesters being sacrificed, 3 to attack, and 1 Reflection of Kiki-Jiki that can attack. So that's 11 damage. But then we're unable to do it again if we tap all of our Reflection of Kiki-Jikis. So maybe only 9 damage. It's on Charles to... Okay, hard cast Leyline of the Void. That will unfortunately not do anything right now, but it will prevent any Scavenger's Talent shenanigans coming out. Nope, meant to do it this way. Any Scavenger's Talent shenanigans coming out from Matt Zhu, which does shut off the Ygra plan. So if Charles can now answer a Blood Tithe Harvester or answer these Reflection of Kiki-Jikis, he's in a really good spot, and Annie joins up will be a perfect way to do that. Five damage to, I guess, yep, is going to wind up hitting a Blood Tithe Harvester? Or is he going after one of the Reflections? If this is going after Blood Tithe Harvester, Lumber will be safe. But it looks like he's going after the Reflection. So we're not going to be able to... we are going to be able to still create a ton of Reflections and a ton of Blood Tithe Harvesters next turn. But this does force one of them. All right, we have an attack for 16 here from this Lumra. That Matt Zhu does still have to worry about. The question is, do you just take 15 or 16 and go down to 3? And then hope that Charles... Actually, Charles being empty-handed here is very tempting. All right, so we're going to have a block, but we're going to wind up having the Reflection of Kiki-Jiki make a copy before that happens, before the Reflection dies. But this does mean now that we're on end step only going to be able to make 2 additional Reflections. That's going to wind up being... So 2 additional Reflections. One of them will get sacrificed at the end of turn because we did this on our opponent's main phase area. Oh, it does look like we wound up making a copy of Blood Tithe Harvester already. Okay, so we didn't make additional copy of Reflection. We have a Ygra in hand. And now a Mayhem Devil. Ooh, look at Matt's face. He knows that was pretty good, but that means he's got to do some math. So if we wind up playing the Mayhem Devil, we can now make 2 more Blood Tithe Harvesters with our remaining Reflections of Kiki Jiki. That is going to wind up being 3 blood tokens. 3 blood tokens means -6, -6. So we have to use all 3 Blood Tithe Harvesters. All 3 token copies of Blood Tithe Harvester. Or at least 2, right? Because that'll wind up being -6, -6. So that's -12. But Lumra is a 16, 16. So that means that the 2 triggers of our Mayhem Devil is not going to be enough. And being able to sack 2 things and do something with a Witch's Oven is only going to be 13. Or sorry, only going to be 15. So it looks like we might have to sacrifice all of our Blood Tithe Harvesters, or sack 14. And then we have to somehow get rid of one of our tokens. But in order to make those Blood Tithe Harvesters, we got to tap those 2 mana. And we know that Matt Zhu's last card in hand is a Ygra. This is the math problem. Just doing a quick count of Charles's lands. 7 untapped. And then 9 taps. Yep. That's 16, 16 Lumra. Matt groaning at the fact of all the math that he has to do. And he's very quickly realizing that he may have to get rid of all of his Blood Tithe Harvesters to do this. We see him just kind of laying things out actually in real time. Doing the the 45-degree tap on the Fable of the Mirror Breakers and the lands just to emulate how that would work. So we have to, if we copy Blood Tithe Harvester, we have 3 bloods in play. That means -6, -6. Once again, that means we have to get rid of all of our Blood Tithe Harvester tokens. We can still keep the actual Blood Tithe Harvester to do this again later. That will give -18, -18 to the Lumra, killing it. That then allows us to get 3 Mayhem Devil triggers. The 3 Mayhem Devil triggers can be pointed at Charles's face. And we can have our Blood Tithe Harvester attack. So that'll knock Charles down to 23. Then Charles is in top deck mode. Has the swamps available, though, to just port the Lumra back. So Matt Zhu is doing all of this work to see if he can kill the Lumra, which Charles will be able to get back tapped next turn, which will gain 7 additional life from those fetch lands that are in his graveyard, plus whatever he mills off the top of his library. And if we really want to, Charles also has a Kenrith the Returned King in his graveyard. Now, Kenrith does have the reanimation ability. So port costing, I forget if it's 5 or 6. Let's take a look at what port has to say. So port costs 6. So Charles can reanimate the Kenrith. Has to tap 2 black to do that. Has 1 remaining black. 16 lands available. Can reanimate Kenrith. Enters the battlefield tapped. And then can just reanimate Lumra to follow that up. All right, so instead it looks like Matt Zhu is going to be copying Mayhem Devil. That'll give us 3 damage per sacrifice that happens. There are going to be 4 sacrifices at the end of turn. So 4 sacrifices at 3 damage each is going to wind up being 12. So you still have to sacrifice both Blood Tithe Harvesters now. Because this is only going to be -2, -2. You haven't made copies of your Blood Tithe Harvester. You don't have the additional bloods. So this will be -4, -4 on the Lumra. That's going to be 2 sacrifice triggers, so that's going to wind up hitting 6 damage. So that's 10 on Lumra, with 6 remaining. We're going to get 3 sacrifice triggers at 3 damage each. So that's 9 damage, so 3 will go to Charles's face. And the remaining 6 should go at Lumra. Alright, we have a cat in the graveyard. That's something I did miss when doing this math. So the cat will sacrifice a food. That gets 3 additional damage down. And Charles gets drained. So that means that we can basically point an additional 3 at Charles's face when these tokens get sacrificed. Because we have 13 out of 16 damage on the Lumra now. And that means that we just only need to point 3 more. And one of the other these tokens get sacrificed at the end of Matju's turn. That means that we're going to wind up having... We couldn't just actually activate the oven, sacrifice the cat, kill the Lumra. We don't have anything to attack with anymore. So then that means that we can sack the food, deal 3 more damage to Charles's face, 4 from the cat coming back into play. That puts Charles at 24. And then 3 tokens being seen by 3 Mayhem Devils is 9 additional damage, puts Charles down to 15. And then we'll see if Charles sees the play to reanimate the Kenrith, bring back the Lumra, go back up to 22, do it all over again. Very pivotal turn here from Matt Zhu, because if Charles does not see his own line, alright, so we see 3 more damage at Lumra, 2 damage at Charles. Sacrificed one of the tokens to make a food, did not sacrifice the cat. Puts Charles down to 20 this way. So potentially 3 missed damage by doing things this way and keeping the cat alive. So now it's Charles's turn. What do we got? Oh, is this a Lotus Cobra? Just make a ton of mana after this too. We only need 11 lands to do, or 12 if you count tapping the port. So we need 12 lands to activate the port and Lumra, port, Kenrith, Lumra play. So that puts Charles on 4 additional mana to kind of play around with. So he's got an Omnath too. Oh baby, we in business. Charles right now is looking at this Port of Carfell and decides to just bring back Lumra. Is not going to wind up bringing back the Kenrith. All right, Annie joins up, says that we get 2 Lumra triggers. So we get to mill 4 twice, and that is going to wind up putting a bunch of lands onto the battlefield. So 7 additional life.
Actually, how big is the Lumra right now?
And with those 2 additional lands that came into play, that is a 18/18 Lumra, plus whatever basics we have left in the deck. Now, I know there's a bunch of forests left still. And there's definitely at least 1 of each other basic in there. I think there's 3 swamp, 3 island, 3 plains, 3 mountains in Charles's list. It looks like, though, with the types of Capenna fetch lands he had, he's only actually able to find a plains and a mountain. So 2 out of 7 wind up getting popped there. But that means that this Lumra now gets to be a 20/20? This is pretty powerful. Oh, and we get a second Lumra trigger because we have an Annie joins up on the battlefield. So, you know, you got that going for you as well, Charles. That finds us 2 additional Fabled Passages. And then we gain an additional 7 life off of all of these Capenna fetch lands that enter the battlefield and sacrifice again. So this should be a 22/22 Lumra. This has been a heck of a turn. If you are tuning in just now, we had Matt Zhu with copies of Mayhem Devils and Fable the Mirror Breakers and a Bloodtithe Harvester chug through all of these sacrifice triggers to hit Charles for 6 damage, kill an 18/18 Lumra, and then it's just not enough still. Charles is able to get the Kenrith back in addition to everything else. A 22/22 Lumra is enough to win Charles game number 2 and force a deciding game number 3 between these 2 titans of the metagame. Damn, that was a math lesson and a half from those decks. Whether it was Charles's life total and the power and toughness of Lumra and trying to figure out the lines with the Port of Carfell, where you can bring back the Kenrith and the Lumra in the same turn, or if it was Matt Zhu having 2 Reflections of Kiki-Jiki, copying a Bloodtithe Harvester, and then making 2 copies of Mayhem Devil with a cat in the graveyard and an active Witch's Oven to drain through a 16 power Lumra and still hit Charles in the face for 6 damage that turn. But even after all of that damage and all of that math, Charles's life total was basically unaffected at the end of everything. And this is what you can see when we were talking about the sideboard between both of these decks last game, where the Rakdos Sacrifice deck will struggle against decks that either stall it out long enough and can deal with its board, like we saw the ill-timed explosion being a well-timed explosion for Charles's deck, and just the incidental life gain that Charles's deck was able to pack. Now, Matt Zhu is able to put up a very big offensive of removal spells to deal with Lotus Cobras, to deal with Nissas, to deal with all sorts of things that Charles was putting down on the battlefield that game, and it forced Charles to basically play 1 or 2 lands per turn. Matt even had that Abrupt Decay to take care of the splunking, so Charles's Capenna fetch lands didn't grant him untapped mana. But what it did grant Charles was at least 7 life over the course of multiple turns, which meant Bloodtithe Harvesters and Reflections of Kiki-Jiki with the Goblin Shamans just weren't able to put a large enough dent in Charles's life total to put Matt in a tempo advantage in that game. And that's why these 5-color decks are usually very difficult matchups for these not only sacrifice decks, but the red-black mid-range decks in general. And we see both players keeping 7, and Charles at pregame actions puts 2 Leyline of the Void into play. Abrupt Decay cannot kill that unless Matt G is packing something like Boseiju or Terrace Under in his sideboard. These Scavenger's Talents basically read, I'm going to make food that you can't do anything with your cats with. Speaking of, Scavenger's Talent is the first card that Mashu plays for his game, so that is going to wind up being basically, like I said, this is just basically going to say whenever a creature dies, we're going to make a food, but we can't utilize the other sides of it. Oh, that's a double Scavenger's Talent opening with a Witch's Oven. No Leyline in the Void. Mashu might have been running away with this game, but Charles has a fetch land, and is just content to pass the turn. I think that's an Annie joins up in hand as well, so if there's like a Mayhem Devil or something else here, that's just going to take that away. But ooh, we see a Thoughtseize here. Is that a Yasharn as well? Yasharn is basically lights out for the sacrifice deck if the Leyline of the Voids weren't bad enough. Yasharn Implacable Earth is a legendary 4/4 that basically says when it enters the battlefield, you can search for a forest card or a plains card and put them into your hand. But the real kicker is that second static ability that says players can't pay life or sacrifice non-land permanents to cast spells or activated abilities. That shuts off the cat, that shuts off so many things from Matt Zhu's deck. And Matt Zhu also had to shock in and Thoughtseize that away. So now already down to 16. Where on the flip side, Charles has just been gaining life up to 21 and is able to resolve this Nissa Resurgent Animist. Last game, this met an immediate Fatal Push. However, this time around, it's going to potentially stick around as I see Fable the Mirror Breaker and a couple of lands in Matt Zhu's hand. So Fable comes down. That is one card that is unaffected by what Charles has presented on the battlefield so far. And it looks like a Ygra in hand from Matt Zhu. So Ygra in and of itself, with a couple of food tokens, can get very large and can rival something like an early Lumra from Charles's deck. What it can't do, though, is create the cat loop with these Leyline of the Voids in play. All right, landfall trigger from this Nissa is going to add 1 mana of any color, and that's going to allow Charles to cast this Tenrith Return King. So Charles doing his best 5-color mid-range impression here and just kind of slamming haymakers one after another, using this Nissa as a mana dork to jump up the curve from 3 to 5, and now has this Kenrith in play, and Matt Zhu just going to discard a couple of lands away and try to find something here off of this Fable the Mirrorbreaker Chapter 2. Cat Oven Ygra would have been amazing if not for these Leylines of the Void. So Charles's pregame actions are basically winning him the game at this point. Now, Kenrith, of course, from Charles' side, is going to be able to do a lot of different things, putting counters on things, gaining life, drawing cards, and eventually reanimating his own Yasharn if he really wants to, which is a very powerful thing that can completely shut Matt Zhu out of the game. We did see Matt, however, having to take some damage from his lands here in order to cast his Ygra, which probably would be very concerning for Charles if he wasn't in this position where he had basically the sacrifice deck on lockdown from his position. And as we saw, sorry, a little bit of lag there from the internet, so the Scryfall didn't pop up, but Ygra Eater of All is usually lights out once it's been hit on the battlefield from the sack deck, but just being kept in check at this point in time. So we have a fetch land from Charles' side, in addition to just tapping his 4 mana, so this is going to be 5 altogether off of the landfall trigger from Nissa Resurgent Animist. And this is just going to be floating black, reanimate the Yasharn. Nope, we get the second landfall trigger from Nissa first. And that is just going to wind up looking at the top cards of our library and revealing them until we find another elf or elemental, which in Charles's deck can be one of 2 things. It can be an additional Nissa, or it can be an Omnath. Oh, I forgot there's also an alchemist version of that one. Omnath, Locus of Creation, the jelly bean with no text that goes into Charles's hand, is going to be another landfall demon here. Being able to draw a card when it enters, then you gain 4 life for your first landfall trigger. The second one gives you Wooburg offensive mana, and then the last one, if you can hit it, is 4 damage to each opponent and Planeswalker they control. All right, the turn does get passed back to Matt Zhu, is going to wind up playing land for turn, throws down the oven, does have a flipped reflection, a Kiki Jiki, and a cat. So a quick little drain of life total here from Matt to Charles, going to be 14 to 21, so a 7 life advantage for Charles currently. And now we do have some Ygra things that we can do. We have a 6/6. we have a 2-2, and there's only a 3-3 and a 5-5 on Charles' side of the battlefield. So if Charles wants, we can try to double block this Ygra, but as you may recall, Ygra has the ability that whenever you sacrifice a food, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. So it looks like just going to be a chump block here onto the Goblin Shaman. We're going to sacrifice that. That's technically a food. So that's going to be putting 2 additional counters onto the Ygra. We're going to sack an additional food that puts 2 additional counters on the Ygra. So that actually is 10 damage swing coming across from Matt to Charles. That's going to be putting Charles down to 11. Matt goes all the way back up to 20 off of eating some food. And now, Charles gets to untap with his Omnath. So let's see what Charles can do. First off, we're going to draw a card. What does Charles find here? Playing a land for turn will gain him 4 life, but ooh, no land, no nothing from Charles. This is a bit of a turn of events that we didn't anticipate. Omnath Pass was not on my menu. And now Matt Zhu has a 10/10 Ygra. Can just start playing Abyss Simulator. And then at least guaranteeing 1 damage a turn by just activating this reflection on the cat. Oh, Omnath on chump blocking duty as well. That's a food that puts 2 more counters on Ygra. Ygra's getting big. Oh, we get to buy Gigantha, the biggest 5 mana food of all. And we got an additional cat. So 21-10 now. Life totals have basically flipped. Charles is now facing down a big, scary cat. All right, we have Capenna Fetchland off the top here from Charles. That'll get us at least 1 trigger from this Nissa and 1 life. That can cast us a Lumra if we want to. But, ooh, second Omnath is probably the reason why we were chump blocking with the first one. That draws us a card. And here we go. We're gaining 4 life. We're making a mana. We're going to get another mana and then have 4 additional mana in our pool. That is going to get us up to 5. That is going to be 6 with this other land on the battlefield. So now this could just be Lumra, which then gets the coveted deal 4 damage trigger with Omnath, which you don't really see in Pioneer. That will get us 3 additional life off of these Capenna fetches. That'll get us 3 additional lands. And now we get the Nissa trigger. This will find us another Nissa. Maybe a Beza, maybe a Lumra. Or it could just find us another Omnath. Ooh, it finds Aftermath Analyst. All right. Now, Aftermath Analyst is another part of this deck that is going to be providing a very big function for your land graveyard type shenanigans. Now, you can return all lands from your battlefield, from their graveyard to your battlefield tapped with its activated ability, and with the overall 5 floating mana, it looks like that this is the play that Charles is going to go for, because that can mill over additional lands. Then we're going to use the remaining mana in our pool. We're going to get this activation. We're going to wind up gaining 3 life off of these Capenna fetches. We're going to wind up taking 4 from Matt Zhu's side from the Omnath trigger. And this does still protect the Lumra in our hand currently, so if any removal comes off the top from Matt Zhu, that's not going to be eating that quite yet. This does make our Lumra get a little bit bigger, and then when we play Lumra next turn, it's going to grow by at least an additional 3 because we have those fetch lands in our graveyard again. And that'll be another way for Charles to keep gaining life. It looks like we did wind up missing the 4 life that Charles gained off of the Omnath from the original landfall trigger. So the life totals have all evened up here now, 17-17. Off of another big turn from Charles coming out here. Now, the best part about this, too, is with that Kenrith on the battlefield, Charles can basically reanimate whatever creature he wants from his graveyard. He's also got a Memory Deluge in the graveyard there, so he can flash that one back for 7. Let's take a peek at his top 7 and grab 2. Oh, it looks like he still had mana floating in his pool as well. So now we get a Lumra. And that is time in the round, too. So we're going to be in turns here as these decks are doing their thing. So we get a Port of Carfell off of that Lumra trigger as well. And this, of course, is thanks to not only the Omnath adding 4 mana to our mana pool, but Nissa Resurgent Animus says that whenever a land rushes the battlefield under your control, you add 1 mana of any color. Then if this is the second time, you get to reveal the top cards from your library until you find an elemental or an elf. So this Nissa in combination with the Omnath means that Omnath made 4, and Nissa wound up making a ton of mana every single time this happened as well. Our Portable Hole will not be able to target the Reflection of Kiki-Jiki. Instead, it has to hit a cat. The Reflection of Kiki-Jiki is a 3 mana creature because of the flip side having a converted mana cost of 3. So we exile one of these cats. And why not? Let's just have a Bez on top of everything as well. All right, Charles's deck has just absolutely taken off this turn. Missed a land drop and is now giving everything haste and trample with the Kenrith as well. While this Ygra is tapped down, does Charles have 17 damage? Matju doing the math. It's 5-3, and that's enough. Charles on the first turn, or turn 0 of turns technically, coming back from missing a land drop to absolutely popping off with his lands deck, takes the round 3, 2-1. He's going to be undefeated at Pioneer Tuesday here at Card Art in Sunnyvale, and that was one hell of a turnaround from a position where I thought Charles might have his back against the wall.